Hello, my name is Jacob Williamson, and this is Technically Speaking at Source Allies. Today, I'm going to be talking about deploying a simple Flask app using Docker, uWSGI, and SSL. This is a continuation on a part 1 video I did about making a simple Flask API. If you'd like to watch that, the link should be in the description below. Okay, so we have our simple Flask app. Just as an overview of what it does, very super duper simple. We have an index page for just getting the index with hello world, very traditional. We have a /books post method that will just post a new book, return us the instance, and the get and delete. We test drove this in, and all of this code should be in a repo that the link should be below for that. This all works well. Caveat, I only have books as a local variable, so none of this is persistently stored. So very simple Flask app. But how might we go about getting this actually up somewhere? I am going to use a very, for me, comfortable pattern of getting a Flask app out there, really any app, doesn't matter. I'm going to use a pattern called a reverse proxy, and I'm going to deploy my Flask app using uWSGI. So I have all the code here. I'll just take you through it. To start off, I have some requirements. This is just the Flask app, so we need Flask, but we also need this uWSGI. This is the thing that's actually going to run our Flask application. The development server in Flask is just that. It's a development server. You should not be using it to actually host your application in a production environment. So that's what we're going to use uWSGI for. This will be the actual production HTTP server that we use. That will sit behind an Nginx. Here's the config file. That will sit behind an Nginx server. Nginx and Apache are typically used to serve some amount of content or to route to other applications, either as a load balancer or just a reverse proxy or both. We like that because it is useful for efficiently returning some content, so static pages, actual JavaScript content, anything like that. But if we have an application that we want to run some code with, like our Flask API, Nginx can delegate that to the actual Python, which is really good at that, whereas the Nginx is not so good. You'll see that pattern a lot as well for PHP, I know, would use Apache or Nginx to actually run the script on the process. A lot of times you'll have something like Spring Boot, where there is an internal Tomcat server that's actually running the requests, but you might have something in front of it that is keeping the request from going to that server unless it's an actual API call. So that's a typical pattern that I like to use. Here, I have it set up such that there is a deploy and a config folder. If we look at our source or our actual structure here, we have a very simple source and test. For now, we can ignore those. We've already dealt with those. The three that I'll bring your attention to are static, deploy, and config. Static is just our static files. We can ignore those for now. You would add all of your content here that isn't being generated by your API. So that leaves deploy and config. So deploy is where we actually set up our Docker Compose. We will use Docker or really any container management system. I'm actually currently using Rancher desktop. You can use Minikube. Colima might be one, or obviously Docker desktop. Or if you're running on Linux, just the straight Docker container D. So we have our Docker Compose file and 2 Docker files. Each one of these Docker files is just whatever I need for the service. So I have a Flask one and an Nginx one. For Flask, I do a very simple copy the actual website and the requirements file. So I copy all the code into here, and then I build it. For Nginx, I really just let it do its thing, except I copy the 2 configuration files into it that I need. So the default Nginx one, or the Nginx config, and then the default, which is more along the lines of my website configuration. You might not call it default, you might call it something else. If your website's named My Cool Website, you might call it mycoolwebsite.conf. This will get loaded after the Nginx conf and usually sets up your server. So if we were to go into it, Nginx conf, Not a whole lot to see in here, just kind of know that it exists. There's a lot of twiddling and tweaking you can do to either give yourself more worker connections, more processes available, change where the actual error logs or even the access logs exist, as well as any of the actual formats of the log. So a lot of things you can tweak in here, but for most things you won't need to. I will draw your attention to here. This is what actually loads those comp files. It is including basically everything in here. So it will include Nginx default right at the end of here. If we go to our Nginx default, this is where I'm setting up the server. So we have two blocks here. The first block is a very simple reroute to HTTPS. If I have an HTTP connection that's trying to be made, I don't really want to serve that, so I will automatically reroute them to HTTPS. That way we can have a nice secure handshake and everyone can go about their day. Here, right below it, is where I set up that actual SSL connection. I set my certificates. So these are under etc SSL, so the domain actual certificate and my private key. Those are not put into this Docker container. Those are volume mapped at compose time. So here in this Docker compose file, they are volume mapped right here. So I have a folder here for SSL. I have simply generated a self-signed cert. So don't do that on your own. You'll want to get an actual certificate provided by some CA authority. Let's Encrypt is a good free option. I believe there's Pork Bun. They have some website providers or website domain providers usually know of or have some option for this. So you would put your SSL into this file. You would never get committed. And every 90 days, you'd probably have to update it. There's ways to automate that. But we volume map those SSL certificates and keys and whatever they are into the etc folder. And that's where the Docker config says to look for them. So that's my certificate for this domain. If you have more than one domain, you'll want to use more than one actual SSL. You'll set the server name. For example, I just did myserver.xyz. I don't actually own that. This is just an example. And then I'll set what the root is. So the root is going to be whatever my server is /public. I did this because it's pretty standard pattern, but that lines up with what I have here. So I've set my static public folder to be volume mapped under www myserver/public. So that is where the root of all this is. And the rest of it is really just configuration on what routes you want to hit. So set up some error pages. If something is returned 404 or 500, these are the error pages. I have those here. I also have a couple of locations. So the first location is the index page. So this slash here, this slash is denoting the index page. You didn't give it a route, you didn't give it anything. So it'll try these files in this order. It'll try that URI, it'll try that URI / an index, or an index HTML, HTML versus HTML. Otherwise, it will redirect to Flask, and that's defined down here. Before that, though, we make sure that anytime you try and get a Python file, which is what our source code is, we're going to actually return a 404. So this just prevents you from trying to download the actual source code from Nginx. And typically, you probably wouldn't be able to anyway because it's containerized. It likely wouldn't even have access to it at this point, but better safe than sorry. Next up is Flask. So Flask is the actual server. It's going to call out to uWSGI, and it will essentially pass all of this info to that server. So here, Flask is the name that the Docker Compose file sets up for it. Docker Compose will automatically network this for you, and it will automagically, spooky, it will automatically change this into whatever proper IP or actual bound network address to go to this from Nginx. So Docker Compose will understand that you mean to go to Flask. And then we set a bunch of proxy headers, and really that's it. This will pass through any API calls that are not of the form / and they don't have .py. It will pass all of those to Flask for you. And then additionally, I like to add a robots.txt. Just tells web crawlers like, hey, please don't look at all my stuff. If the web crawler's nice, they'll listen to it. If they're not, they won't pay any mind to it. Just something I like to do. So that's the Nginx config. The actual config for the Flask HTTP server doesn't have nearly as much. You just tell it what socket you want it to listen to. That port is important. It's the same port that you have in your Nginx here. And you tell it the actual file that you want it to call. So here we have the app server.py. If we remember, that is the server here that runs our API. And the callable app right there is defined here in the INI file. So those are the config files. Those get run, or those get volume mapped in or copied when you build your Docker Compose, and you can run it. I'll stop it right here. But the simple way you run it is you will Docker Compose up. You need to give it the actual file. So here, since Docker Compose.yaml is not in my base directory over here, it doesn't know where to find it, so I have to do this -f and tell it the actual file. But importantly, I'm doing that while I'm in this root directory because I want it to be run from here. So I'll do that. It will simply create them. It will spawn the workers. I've actually set this to be one worker just to make my life a little easier, and it sets up the Nginx as well. So if I were to run curl, and recall that I have a self-signed certificate. So with curl, I need to add K to it to just ignore certificates. HTTPS//localhost. If I run that, it will return me the doc type or the document of hello world. And then if I were to do something really simple, like post a book, and recall that, and notice that I am on HTTPS. If I were to post a book, X post -h content type application JSON, you would very likely have some sort of app doing this instead of hand crafting it like I am, but that's fine. Let me see if I can remember. I think it's name, some book, author, me. There we go. So I've curled books, posted a new one called some book at author of me. I am going to use this location header that I get back, and I'm just going to call get /books/ that thing, and it returns author me, name some book. So that is the basics of standing up a deployable application. If you wanted to put this on an instance somewhere, you would simply build your Docker images. You could also build them inline, but you would build them, use them somehow by sending the Docker Compose file to the instance. You would also send the SSL somehow to the instance. The config files, those are again being referenced in Docker Compose here with uWSGI with this INI file, and the static public files. You would probably zip all of these up, and then in your process of turning on the application in the instance, you would unzip them, do Docker Compose up -f with that file location, and it should start up. This has been Jacob speaking technically with Source Allies. Have a topic you want covered? Comment it down below. If you want to learn more about Source Allies, check out our website in either the description or our profile. We'll see you next time.